Hey yo, today is October 19th, 2021. This is the 27th entry. It's a beautiful Tuesday morning, and I have quite a bit on my mind today. I wanted to talk more about what I talked about yesterday and respond to some of the comments I saw. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody leaving comments. When I first started this channel, I thought I was going to live in anonymity for a very, very long time. I thought I was just going to post 100 videos and get like 2 views, and I think I have the perfect audience right now. 20-ish people who leave comments that aren't mean, and I get to sort of read them, and I get feedback, and I get to have new things to think about, so I appreciate it. And also, I've never been complimented by being called a piece of salmon covered in honey, which is possibly the nicest thing anybody's ever said. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, another person in the comment section was mentioning femininity and masculinity, and I kind of wanted to talk about that. So these are hard to define. I usually start by thinking, like, if I took the entire population of women on the planet and I was to sort of average them together and then find the common characteristics between all of them, is that femininity? Or if I were to take the average of all men and all women and then find what they have in common within the sex and not with the other sex. So, for example, something like height would be kind of a masculine characteristic, because you'd find that on average men are taller. But that gets kind of weird, because you can't, if we're talking about attraction, like, what am I attracted to? And if I was to say, okay, I'm attracted to femininity, what exactly does that mean? And also, if that's true, why would I not be attracted to feminine men? If you were to take the top 1% most feminine men on the planet, wouldn't they be attractive to some guy who's heterosexual if femininity was all you needed? So that's why, I mean, also, what characteristics would you find across all women? What characteristics? I mean, physically, it wouldn't be that hard to come up with a couple things, but emotionally or mentally, characteristically, I mean, or like personality-wise, what do all women have in common that men don't have? Such a hard question. And, what makes it even harder is that you have to disentangle it. You have to separate it from things that are just a part of history or societal history. I think there are some personality characteristics of women that are not a result of historical circumstances, but separating them out from historical circumstances is just really difficult. Real quick, I just want to show you, I realized in a lot of my videos that the leaves crunching beneath my feet was a big issue, like really loud on the audio. So I spent a little while yesterday just raking out a path, just to make the audio slightly better, So, yeah, am I attracted to femininity? Do I find a more feminine woman more attractive than a less feminine woman? I don't know. That's hard for me to answer. Because I typically, the women that I've been in more serious relationships with are typically not, I mean, they're physically feminine. They have long hair and they look girly, I guess, but in terms of their personality, I seem to end up with women who like to disagree with me quite a bit. I don't know if that's something I'm attracted to, or if those are the types of women that are attracted to me. Like, I don't seem to end up with submissive women, usually. At least not personality-wise. They're not the types that would just Like, I really hate it when I'm with somebody, anybody really, like, it could be a friend, but especially in a relationship. I hate it when I'm with people that will just do anything that I say, like, that just go along with whatever I want. You know, and something simple like you're picking out a restaurant and they go, oh, you choose. And like, they will never choose. I used to have this buddy. This is a guy, but he was a very feminine guy. He was a gay dude. Very feminine, self-described feminine. So I'm not making this up. He would not choose where we would go and to go out to hang out, to go eat. And so sometimes I'd be like, no, I absolutely refuse to decide. And he would always say, you know, he'd always pick a spot and he'd go, but only if you're okay with it. Only if you're okay with it. And then we'd be like walking up to the place. He'd be like, are you sure you're okay with this spot? Are you sure you're okay with this spot? And that always used to drive me crazy. I'm like, just pick a goddamn spot and stick to it. You know, like there's a kind of like assertiveness that I would want, even in a friend, but especially in a relationship. Like, I could not stand being in a relationship with somebody that let me make all the decisions. I don't know if all guys feel that way. Maybe some guys want to make every single decision. I just want somebody who will argue with me, I think. So, and I don't know if the urge to argue with your partner, like, to me, that seems like more of a masculine characteristic. So, but maybe I'm totally off about, like, do femininity and masculinity even exist? Or are they just sort of like these social constructions? Somebody in the comments section said that is what is the construction, that gender's not the construct. Like, men and women, man, woman, those aren't constructs, but the characteristics of men and women, so masculinity and femininity, those are the constructs. But again, like I'm saying, like, I think there are characteristics that we have that are not constructs, even personality-wise, even mentally and emotionally. And just dissecting those away from what is a construct socially is, I mean, how do you even approach that from an experimental perspective? Like, how would you pick out a characteristic and say, okay, because everybody's a part of society. Everybody's been born and raised and has some, you know, we've all been molded by our world, and nobody escapes from it unless you're living out in the woods by yourself. Nobody escapes from it. So, and are they necessarily bad? This is what I was talking about. Do we want to, because I understand the feminist perspective that we want to remove any bad constructs. You would want to, I mean, you'd want to identify the construct and then see that call it a bad thing and then get rid of it. Like, maybe, for example, what's an example of a bad thing? Like the idea that women just have to be submissive and do whatever the guy says, right? Like, that is something that I could see the feminists wanting to get rid of, and I could agree with that one, right? Like, I don't even know. It's hard for me to believe that even in history that was entirely the expectation, because I can't imagine, like, pick some random example, like some farmer in medieval Europe, and he's living there and he's got like a wife and kids, and, you know, was the wife submissive and like doing everything the guy says, or was it probably more like a modern relationship where the wife would be arguing with him and telling him, giving him shit about stuff, and, you know, he'd be doing what she says sometimes, and it just depends on the particular relationship. Like, maybe men and women have always just, I don't know, I'm just talking past what I know. That's the point of this channel, is talking out loud, saying what I think. I sometimes get the sense, and this is directly aimed at the feminists, I get the sense that there's kind of like a fantasy reality that feminists think has existed in the past. And I want to give kind of an example of this. So imagine you're in a nomadic tribe. Like, this is 20,000 years ago, you know, and out in wherever land, a little band of nomadic people, 100 of them, and it's the stereotypical setup where you got mostly guys are doing the hunting or something like that, and who knows what the women are doing. Like, there would be a division of labor between the sexes, right? And I'm imagining a scenario where you have a girl in this tribe who is really into hunting and actually demonstrates skill in this, right? She demonstrates, like, from a young age, demonstrates like a passion for it and then a skill for it. And sure, she's not as physically as strong as the men, but I mean, what aspects of hunting require physical strength? You know, like, not all of it. You could be very good at hunting and have very little strength, I would think. And so, if this girl is showing this skill and the interest, you'd think that the tribe, even if the tribe was like a patriarchal tribe, they're not going to be like, no, you get over to the river and wash the clothing. You know, they're not going to like say, no, you do the sewing. They're going to be like, oh, we have a skilled hunter. Let's bring her along on the hunt. And so I think there's kind of like the feminist fantasy is this idea, like, from what's the movie Brave with the archer girl, where she's like a god of archery, like the best archer to ever live, and everybody in society is like, no, you need to stop doing this. Like, I think that's kind of like it's a fantasy, because like a reasonable group of people would recognize the talent and then utilize it for the sake of the tribe. They'd be like, get out there and go kill a bison for us. And then she'd be like, aye, aye. And so that to me is a more realistic scenario, right? Like, I don't think that there would be this crushing force like the feminists seem to think there is. Like, I do understand that there is some amount of crushing, but it's always more nuanced. It's not as simple as women, like all women were forced to do this thing. I mean, things are different now. I'm sure society today is radically different than it was back then, and I'm sure that there were cases where there were women that did have interests and they weren't allowed to do things. And there's all like the modern examples, like the way that we discovered. I should remember the name of this. There's a chunk. There's parts of your DNA that will jump around. There's like entire chunks of your genome that will remove themselves and sort of put themselves somewhere else. I don't remember the name. I used to know this, but it was discovered by a female scientist, a woman scientist, and nobody believed her. And I can't help but think that has something to do with some sexist conceptions, right? And it turns out she was right, but they figured it out like years later. So like those things do happen. There are cases where we don't utilize members of society properly because of social norms that exist. And that's a problem. That's a problem for everybody. Like, had people listened to this scientist sooner, we would have had this knowledge sooner. And, you know, that's something we got to deal with. But just to push back on that a little bit, just to make sure that I'm, you know, being argumentative here, I would say that there is some evidence to show that men are on average more interested in things and women are on average more interested in people. I mean, I've heard a lot of, you know, I'm no psychologist, I'm no social scientist, but there have been studies where they'll take like baby chimpanzees and give them like pickup trucks and dolls. And just on average, the female chimpanzees are more likely to pick up the doll, and the male chimpanzees are more likely to pick up the pickup truck. Like, maybe I've just made up that study. I've heard of things like this. I've heard that there have been demonstrations that there is something with the female brain and the male brain that is just on average different. And it's not saying that there's a lot of overlap, is what I mean. Is like there's like 90% overlap. But if you take like the one person who is like the most interested in things, it's more likely to be a male than a female. And I think it's possible that this is why we see more male scientists. And then so, given that, if you have a female scientist or a female who claims to be a scientist, like is trying to be a scientist, it makes sense to be slightly more skeptical. And I know what that sounds like. I'm not saying that you should want to have sexism. You don't want irrational skepticism, but you want when it comes to things like, I don't know why I'm focused on the science aspect right now, but when it comes to things like, women talk about how they have to prove themselves harder. Like, women have to prove themselves 10 times harder than men in the workplace. I've seen that. I've heard that, and I've watched it happen in my own profession, where you'll have women coders who get hired. You'll have a software developer who's a woman, and there is a degree of skepticism that just exists immediately. The second she walks into the room, everybody's like, like that would not exist if it was a man. And to some extent, yes, that is sexism. But, well, I'm venturing into dangerous territory here. Very dangerous territory. If it is true that men are more likely to become engineers, and we also live in this world where we have a desire to have equal representation in everything. So this is also an issue with, I'm going into real dangerous territory right here. I mean, well, here we go. This is also a danger with affirmative action on a racial, affirmative action for something like black people or just non-white people. I would use the word people of color, but I really hate that. I really hate people of color. I think that's a terrible term. But okay, like, we should stop using these categories altogether, these racial categories, but I'll use them as long as everybody else is using them, I guess. Like, say you're working in a company where it's all software engineers, right? Or you're in the branch of the company that is software engineers. And you know that this company has policies that are trying to create equal representation between sexes and between races. So, the problem with this, I don't know how I got to this subject, but whatever. The problem with this policy, is that now, like, let's say that you're in this company, and a white guy walks in, a new hire. He's a white guy. You know that he was hired not because of this affirmative action. You know that he must have been hired because, I mean, theoretically, if your interview process is all right, and I know interview processes are usually crap, but, in theory, you would assume that, okay, this guy is skilled enough to have this job. But say a black guy walks in the room, or a woman. Now you're thinking, is this person skilled enough? Or are they here because of this affirmative action thing? Did they choose a less skilled employee for the sake of equal representation? And then now it's like, is it sexist or racist to think this thing? Or are you just questioning, are you just adding skepticism in because you have this policy now? Like, I wonder about that sometimes. And, wow. It's like, okay, here's probably a non-controversial claim. Probably a non-controversial claim. So, I get the sense that men are more likely to be sexually perverted than women. I know, I'm not saying that there aren't sexual degenerates in women. I'm not saying that women are incapable of the same perversions of men, but I think on average, men are slightly more perverted, and that means that the extremes, if you take like the most extremely perverted person, it's going to be a male. And I think this is part of the reason why we see skepticism around male teachers, or something like that. It's because, like, there's always this degree of, like, is this person here to, like, do some bad things with some kids? And I don't think that same amount of skepticism exists in women, and that's sort of is that sexist? Or is that a reasonable skepticism? And, like, these are the kinds of things I think about. It's like, I understand the intention of, like, removing all preconceived notions about all sexual differences, but there are actual differences between men and women, which I think I can reasonably say, like, there are real differences. between us physically, mentally, sexually, emotionally. And then these create differences at the extremes. And I think these extreme differences have existed throughout all of society, throughout all of history. And so we have these sort of, the human race has recognized these patterns over time. And maybe we can't articulate them explicitly, but we have these like inbuilt, we have these preconceived biases, which might be unfair to most people, but they're like safeguards against the most extremes, And so, yeah, when you're in the tribe where the girl picks up the bow and she's like, I want to come hunting with you. Like, maybe it makes sense to be slightly more skeptical, but, like maybe it makes sense to make her work twice as hard to prove herself, right? But like, no, like we don't really believe you. You're going to have to work harder than the guy to prove yourself. But if she proves herself, there's really no reason to keep her out at that point, right? You would want to utilize her and have her kill things for you. So it's like, I'm sure that... oh man, I'm sure that I've said some things that are a little bit controversial here. These are just the things I think about. There are differences between the sexes. There just are. And they matter. They really matter. And for a long time, I believed that there weren't. I sort of bought into this notion that the only reason that we'd have any behavioral difference between a man and a woman is because of society. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think that we have behavioral differences because we are just animals, and the males and females of a species just behave differently. Like slightly. Two of my favorite people, two biologists two of my favorite biologists say that while we are not blank slates, human beings aren't blank slates, but we are the blankest slates of the animal kingdom. So whatever inbuilt characteristics we do have, whatever things we are born with, whatever differences there are between the sexes, I think that it can be closed. Those differences can be erased more easily than any other animal, because we're so, humans we're like mostly software, right? But you can't completely get rid of them. You can't completely ignore those differences. They will never be gone forever. So it's just stuff you have to think about. And so maybe characteristics of masculinity and femininity are just those average differences. And maybe that has something to do with what's sexually attractive to one versus the other. I was going to talk about that. That was kind of the thing I wanted to talk about. What is attractive? I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. I sort of get the feeling that here, I'm going to do a complete jump to another thing. I get the feeling that straight never existed, and then so gay as a category didn't really need to exist either. Like these categories that we make, like I think, I was listening to the video I did yesterday. Something that I do too much of is I think too much in black and whites. I put things into categories, like hard categories. I have like binary categories, and I don't allow for differences. Like I brought up this concept how I could see a picture of a girl who's very attractive to me, but then it turns out that that's a man because of the trans man concept, right? Like you could show me a picture of Scarlett Johansson and be like, oh, but she identifies as a man, and that would make me gay, right? And so like, to me, that brought me to like, all right, I must be bisexual, when really I should have been like, all right, maybe these categories are a little bit fuzzy. Maybe it's like it's not quite like, okay, if you're straight, you're like literally only attracted to people that are walking around with vaginas, and maybe the categories are a little bit more fuzzy. Maybe the categories don't really exist. I mean, they must exist. All right, I'm going way too off the rails. I'm probably going to stop this video right now. Okay, bye.